The Human Person and Human Rights, Part 2. Third, the many aspects of the human person. Prizing highly the marvelous biblical message, the Church's social doctrine stops to dwell above all on the principal and indispensable dimensions of the human person. Thus, it is able to grasp the most significant facets of the mystery and dignity of human beings. In the past, there has been no lack of various reductionist conceptions of the human person, many of which are still dramatically present on the stage of modern history. These are ideological in character or are simply the result of widespread forms of custom or thought concerning mankind, human life, and human dignity. The common denominator among these is the attempt to make the image of man unclear by emphasizing only one of his characteristics at the expense of all the others. The human person may never be thought of only as an absolute individual being, built up by himself and on himself, as if his characteristic traits depended on no one else but himself. Nor can the person be thought of as a mere cell of an organism that is inclined at most to grant it recognition in its functional role with the overall system. Reductionist conceptions of the full truth of men and women have already been the object of the Church's social concern many times, and she has not failed to raise her voice against these, as against other drastically reductive perspectives, taking care to proclaim instead that individuals do not feel themselves isolated units, like grains of sand, but united by the very force of their nature and by their internal destiny into an organic, harmonious mutual relationship. She has affirmed instead that man cannot be understood simply as an element, a molecule within the social organism, and is therefore attentive that the affirmation of the primacy of the person is not seen as corresponding to an individualistic or mass vision. Christian faith, while inviting that whatever is good and worthy of man should be sought out wherever it may be found. Our reference, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21, is above and is sometimes opposed to the ideologies in that it recognizes God, who is transcendent and the Creator, and who, through all the levels of creation, calls on man as endowed with responsibility and freedom. The Church's social doctrine strives to indicate the different dimensions of the mystery of man, who must be approached in the full truth of his existence, of his personal being, and also of his community and social being, with special attention so that the value of the human person may be readily perceived. Man was created by God in unity of body and soul. The spiritual and immortal soul is the principle of unity of the human being, whereby it exists as a whole, corporit et anima unus, as a person. These definitions not only point out that the body, which has been promised the resurrection, will also share in glory. They also remind us that reason and free will are linked with all the bodily and sense faculties. The person, including the body, is completely entrusted to himself, and it is in the unity of body and soul that the person is the subject of his own moral acts. Through this corporeality, man unites in himself elements of the material world. These reach their summit through him, and through him raise their voice in free praise of the Creator. This dimension makes it possible for man to be part of the material world, but not as in a prison or in exile. It is not proper to despise bodily life. Rather, man is obliged to regard his body as good and honorable, since God has created it and will raise it up on the last day. Because of this bodily dimension, however, following the wound of sin, man experiences the rebellion of his body and the perverse inclinations of his heart. He must always keep careful what's over this list. He become enslaved to them and become a victim of a purely earthly vision of life. Through his spirituality, man moves beyond the realm of mere things and plunges into the innermost structure of reality. When he enters into his own heart, that is, when he reflects on his destiny, he discovers that he is superior to the material world because of his unique dignity as one who converses with God, under whose gaze he makes decisions about his life. In his inner life, he recognizes that the person has a spiritual and immortal soul, and he knows that the person is not merely a speck of nature or a nameless constituent of the city of men. Therefore, man has two different characteristics. He is a material being, linked to this world by his body, and he is a spiritual being, open to transcendence and to the discovery of more penetrating truths, thanks to his intellect, by which he shares in the light of the divine mind. The Church affirms the unity of soul and body is so profound that one has to consider the soul to be the form of the body. It is because of its spiritual soul that the body, made of matter, becomes a living. Human body, spirit and matter, in man are not two natures united, but rather their union forms a single nature. Neither the spiritualism that despises the reality of the body, nor the materialism that considers the spirit a mere manifestation of the material, do justice to the complex nature, to the totality or to the unity of the human being. Openness to transcendence belongs to the human person. Man is open to the infinite and to all created beings. He is open above all to the infinite God, because with his intellect and will, he raises himself above all the created order and above himself. He becomes independent from creatures, is free in relation to created things, and tends towards total truth and the absolute good. He is open also to others, to the men and women of the world, because only insofar as he understands himself in reference to a thou can he say, I. He comes out of himself from the self-centered preservation of his own life to enter into a relationship of dialogue and communion with others. The human person is open to the fullness of being, to the unlimited horizon of being. He has in himself the ability to transcend the individual particular objects that he knows, thanks effectively to his openness to unlimited being. In a certain sense, the human soul is, because of its cognitive dimension, all immaterial things enjoy a certain infiniteness insofar as they embrace everything, or because it is a question of the essence of a spiritual reality that functions as a model and likeness of everything, as is the case with God, or because it has a likeness to everything, or is in act like the angels, or in potential like souls. Man exists as a unique and unrepeatable being. He exists as an I, capable of self-understanding, self-possession, and self-determination. The human person is an intelligent and conscious being, capable of reflecting on himself and therefore of being aware of himself and his actions. However, it is not intellect, consciousness, and freedom that define the person. Rather, it is the person who is the basis of the acts of intellect, consciousness, and freedom. These acts can ever be absent, for even without them, man does not cease to be a person. The human person must always be understood in his unrepeatable and inviolable uniqueness. In fact, man exists above all as a subjective entity, as a center of consciousness and freedom, whose unique life experiences, comparable to those of no one else, underlie inadmissibility of any attempt to reduce his status by forcing him into preconceived categories or power systems, whether ideological or otherwise. This entails, above all, the requirement not only of simple respect on the part of others, especially political and social institutions and their leaders with regard to every man and woman on the earth, but even more, this means that the primary commitment of every person towards others, and particularly of these same institutions, must be for the promotion and integral development of the person. A just society can become a reality only when it is based on the respect of the transcendent dignity of the human person. The person represents the ultimate end of society by which it is ordered to the person. Hence, the social order and its development must invariably work to the benefit of the human person, since the order of things is subordinate to the order of persons and not the other way around. Respect for human dignity can in no way be separated from obedience to this principle. It is necessary to consider every neighbor without exemption as another self, taking into account first of all his life and the means necessary for living it with dignity. Every political, economic, social, scientific, and cultural program must be inspired by the awareness of the primacy of each human being over society. In no case, therefore, is the human person to be manipulated for ends that are foreign to his own development, which can find complete fulfillment only in God and His plan of salvation. In fact, man in his interiority transcends the universe and is the only creature willed by God for itself. For this reason, neither his life, nor the development of his thought, nor his good, nor those who are part of his personal and social activities can be subjected to unjust restrictions in the exercise of their rights and freedom. The person cannot be a means for carrying out economic, social, or political projects imposed by some authority, even in the name of an alleged progress of the civil community as a whole or of other persons, either in the present or the future. It is therefore necessary that public authorities keep careful watch so that restriction placed on freedom or any onus placed on personal activity will never become harmful to personal dignity, thus guaranteeing the effective practicability of human rights. All this, once more, is based on the vision of man as a person, that is to say, as an active and responsible subject of his own growth process, together with the community to which he belongs. Authentic social changes are effective and lasting only to the extent that they are based in resolute changes in personal conduct. An authentic moralization of social life will never be possible unless it starts with people, and as people as its point of reference. Indeed, living a moral life bears witness to the dignity of the person. It is obviously the task of people to develop those moral attitudes that are fundamental for any society that truly wishes to be human: justice, honesty, truthfulness, and so on, and which in no way can simply be expected of others or delegated to institutions. It is the task of everyone, and in a special way of those who hold various forms of political, judicial, or professional responsibility with regard to others, to be the watchful conscience of society and the first to bear witness to civil social conditions that are worthy of human beings. Man can turn to good only in freedom, which God has given to him as one of the high signs of his image. For God has willed that man remain under the control of his own decision, Sirach chapter 15, verse 14, so that he can seek his Creator spontaneously and come freely to utter and blissful perfection through loyalty to him. Demands that he act according to a knowing and free choice that is personally motivated and prompted from within, neither under blind internal impulse nor by mere external pressure. Man rightly appreciates freedom and strives for it passionately. Rightly does he desire and must form and guide, by his own free initiative, his personal and social life, accepting personal responsibility for it. In fact, freedom not only allows man suitably to modify the state of things outside of himself, but it also determines the growth of his being as a person through choices consistent with the true good. In this way, man generates himself. He is father of his own being. He constructs the social order. Freedom is not contrary to man's dependence as a creature on God. Revelation teaches that the power to decide good and evil does not belong to man but to God alone. Our reference, Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 to 17. Man is certainly free in as much as he can understand and accept God's commands, and he possesses an extremely far-reaching freedom, since he can eat of every tree of the garden. But his freedom is not unlimited. It must halt before the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for it is called to accept the moral law given by God. In fact, human freedom finds its authentic and complete fulfillment precisely in the acceptance of that law. The proper exercise of personal freedom requires specific conditions of an economic, social, juridic, political, and cultural order that are too often disregarded or violated. Such situations of blindness and injustice injure the moral life and involve the strong as well as the weak in the temptation to sin against charity. By deviating from the moral law, man violates his own freedom, becomes imprisoned within himself, disrupts neighborly fellowship, and rebels against divine truth. Removing injustices promotes human freedom and dignity. Nonetheless, the first thing to be done is to appeal to the spiritual and moral capacities of the individual and to the permanent need for inner conversion if one is to achieve the economic and social changes that will truly be at the service of men. In the exercise of their freedom, men and women perform morally good acts that are constructive for the person and for society when they are obedient to truth. That is, when they do not presume to be the creators and absolute masters of truth or of ethical norms. Freedom, in fact, does not have its absolute and unconditional origin in itself, but in the life within which it is situated and which represents for it, at one and the same time, both a limitation and a possibility. Human freedom belongs to us as creatures. It is a freedom which is given as a gift, one to be received like a seed and to be cultivated responsibly. When the contrary is the case, freedom dies, destroying man and society. The truth concerning good and evil is recognized in a practical and concrete manner by the judgment of conscience, which leads to the acceptance of responsibility for the good accomplished and the evil committed. Consequently, in the practical judgment of conscience, which imposes on the person the obligation to perform a given act, the link between freedom and truth is made manifest. Precisely for this reason, conscience expresses itself in acts of judgment, which reflect the truth about the good and not in arbitrary decisions. The maturity and responsibility of these judgments, and when all is said and done, of the individual who is their subject, are not measured by the liberation of the conscience from objective truth. in favor of an alleged autonomy in personal decisions, but on the contrary, by an insistent search for truth and by allowing oneself to be guided by the truth in one's salvation. The exercise of freedom implies a reference to a natural moral law of a universal character that precedes and unites all rights and duties. The natural law is nothing other than light of intellect infused within us by God. Thanks to this, we know what must be done and what must be avoided. This light or this law has been given by God to creation. It consists in the participation in His eternal law, which is identified with God Himself. This law is called natural because the reason that promulgates it is proper to human nature. It is universal. It extends to all people insofar it is established by reason. In its principal precepts, the divine and natural law is presented in the Decalogue and indicates the primary and essential norms regulating moral life. Its central focus is the act of aspiring and submitting to God, the source and judge of everything that is good, and also the act of seeing others as equal to oneself. The natural law expresses the dignity of the person and lays the foundations of the person's fundamental duties. In the diversity of cultures, the natural law unites peoples, enjoining common principles. Although its application may require adaptations to the many different conditions of life according to place, time, and circumstances, it remains immutable under the flux of ideas and customs and supports their progress, even when it is rejected in its very principles. It cannot be destroyed or removed from the heart of man. It always rises again in the life of individuals and societies. In precepts, however, are not only clearly and immediately perceived by everyone. Religious and moral truths can be known by everyone with facility, with firm certainty, and without admixture of error. Only with the help of grace and revelation, the natural law offers a foundation prepared by God for the revealed law and grace in full harmony with the work of the Spirit. The natural law, which is the law of God, cannot be annulled by human sinfulness. It lays the indispensable moral foundation for building the human community and for establishing the civil law that draws its consequences of a concrete and contingent nature from the principles of the natural law. If the perception of the universality of the moral law is dim, people cannot build a true and lasting communion with others, because when a correspondence between truth and good is lacking, whether culpably or not, our acts damage the communion of persons to the detriment of each. Only freedom, rooted in a common nature, in fact, can make all men responsible and enable them to justify public morality. Those who proclaim themselves to be the sole measure of realities and of truth cannot live peacefully in society with their fellow men and cooperate with them. Freedom mysteriously tends to betray the openness to truth and human goodness, and too often it prefers evil and being selfishly closed off, raising itself to the status of a divinity that creates good and evil. Although he was made by God in a state of holiness, from the very onset of history, man abused his liberty at the urging of the evil one. Man set himself against God and sought to attain his goal apart from God. Often refused to acknowledge God as his beginning. Man has disrupted also his proper relationship to his own ultimate goal, as well as his whole relationship toward himself and others and all created things. Human freedom needs therefore to be liberated. Christ, by the power of his paschal mystery, frees man from his disordered love of self, which is the source of his contempt for his neighbor and of those relationships marked by dominion of others. Christ shows us that freedom attains its fulfillment in the gift of self. By his sacrifice on the cross, Jesus places man once more in communion with God and his neighbor. God shows no partiality. Acts chapter 10, verse 34. Romans chapter 2, verse 11. Galatians chapter 2, verse 6. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 9. Since all people have the same dignity as creatures made in his image and likeness. The incarnation of the Son of God shows the equality of all people with regard to dignity. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, Romans chapter 10, verse 12, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 13, Colossians chapter 3, verse 11. Since something of the glory of God shines on the face of every person, the dignity of every person before God is the basis of the dignity of man before other men. Moreover, this is the ultimate foundation of the radical equality and brotherhood among all people, regardless of the race, nation, sex, origin, culture, or class. Only the recognition of human dignity can make possible the common and personal growth of everyone. Our reference, James chapter 2, verse 1 to 9. To stimulate this kind of growth, it is necessary in particular to help the least, effectively ensuring conditions of equal opportunity for men and women and guaranteeing an objective equality between the different social classes before the law. Also, in relations between people and state, conditions of equality and parity are prerequisites for the authentic progress of the international community. Despite the steps taken in this direction, it must not forget that there still exist many inequalities and forms of dependence. Together with equality in the recognition of the dignity of its person and of every people, there must also be an awareness that it will be possible to safeguard and promote human dignity, and if this is done as a community, by the whole of humanity, only through the mutual action of individuals and peoples, sincerely concerned for the good of all men and women, can a genuine universal brotherhood be attained. Otherwise, the persistence of conditions of serious disparity and inequality will make us all poorer. Male and female differentiate two individuals of equal dignity, which does not, however, reflect a static equality, because the specificity of the female is different from the specificity of the male. And this difference in equality is enriching and indispensable for the harmony of life in society. The condition that will ensure the rightful presence of man in the church and in society is a more penetrating and accurate consideration of the anthropological foundation for masculinity and femininity, with the intent of clarifying woman's personal identity in relation to man. That is a diversity yet mutual complementarily, not only as it concerns roles to be held and functions to be performed, but also and more deeply as it concerns her make-up and meaning as a person. Woman is the complement of man, as man is the complement of woman. Man and woman complete each other mutually, not only from a physical and psychological point of view, but also ontologically. It is only because of the duality of male and female that the human being becomes a full reality. It is the unity of the two, or in other words, a relational uniduality, that allows its person to experience the interpersonal and reciprocal relationship as a gift that at the same time is a mission. To this unity of the two, God has entrusted not only the work of procreation and family life, but the creation of history itself. The woman is a helper for the man, just as the man is a helper for the woman. In the encounter of man and woman, a unitary conception of the human person is brought about, based not only on the logic of self-centeredness and self-affirmation, but on that of love and solidarity. Persons with disabilities are fully human subjects with rights and duties, in spite of the limitations and sufferings affecting their bodies and faculties. They point up more clearly the dignity and greatness of man. Since persons with disabilities are subjects with all their rights, they are to be helped to participate in every dimension of family and social life at every level accessible to them and according to their possibilities. The rights of persons with disabilities need to be promoted with effective and appropriate measures. It would be radically unworthy of man and a denial of our common humanity to admit to the life of the community and thus admit to work only those who are fully functional. To do so would be to practice a serious form of discrimination, that of the strong and healthy against the weak and sick. Great attention must be paid not only to the physical and psychological work conditions, to adjust wage, to the possibility of promotion and the elimination of obstacles, but also to the affective and sexual dimensions of persons with disabilities. They too need to love and to be loved. They need tenderness, closeness, and intimacy, according to their capacities and with respect for the moral order, which is the same for the non-handicapped and the handicapped alike. The human person is essentially a social being, because God, who created humanity, willed it so. Human nature, in fact, reveals itself as a nature of a being who responds to his own needs. This is based on a relational subjectivity, that is, in the manner of a free and responsible being who recognizes the necessity of integrating himself in cooperation with his fellow human beings, and who is capable of communion with them on the level of knowledge and love. A society is a group of persons bound together organically by a principle of unity that goes beyond each one of them. As an assembly that is at once visible and spiritual, a society endures through time. It gathers up the past and prepares for the future. It is therefore necessary to stress that community life is a natural characteristic that distinguishes man from the rest of earthly creatures. Social activity carries in itself a particular sign of man and of humanity, that of a person at work within a community of persons. This is the sign that determines man's interior traits and, in a sense, constitutes his very nature. This relational characteristic takes on, in the light of faith, a more profound and enduring meaning. Made in the image and likeness of God. Our reference, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. And made visible in the universe in order to live in society. Our reference, Genesis chapter 2, verses 20 and verse 23. And exercise dominion over the earth. Our reference, Genesis chapter 1, verses 26, 28 to 30. The human person is for this reason called from the very beginning to life in society. God did not create man as a solitary being, but wished him to be a social being. Social life, therefore, is not exterior to man. He can only grow and realize his vocation in relation with others. The social nature of human beings does not automatically lead to communion among persons to the gift of self. Because of pride and selfishness, man discovers in himself the seeds of asocial behavior, impulses leading him to close himself with his own individuality and to dominate his neighbor. Every society worthy of the name can be sure that it stands in the truth when all of its members, thanks to their ability to know what is good, are able to pursue it for themselves and for others. It is out of love for one's own good and for that of others that people come together in stable groups with the purpose of attaining a common good. The different human societies also must establish among themselves relationships of solidarity, communication, and cooperation in the service of man and the common good. The social nature of human beings is not uniform but is expressed in many different ways. In fact, the common good depends on a healthy social pluralism. The different components of society are called to build a unified and harmonious whole within which it is possible for each element to preserve and develop its own characteristics and autonomy. Some components, such as the family, the civil community, and the religious community, respond more immediately to the intimate nature of man, which others come about more on a voluntary basis. To promote the participation of the greatest number in the life of a society, the creation of voluntary associations and institutions must be encouraged on both national and international levels, which relate to economic and social goals, to cultural and recreational activities, to sport, to various professions, and to political affairs. This socialization also expresses the natural tendency for the sake of attaining objectives that exceed individual capacities. It develops the qualities of the person, especially the sense of initiative and responsibility, and helps guarantee his rights. Fourth, human rights. The movement towards the identification and proclamation of human rights is one of the most significant attempts to respond effectively to the inescapable demands of human dignity. The Church sees in these rights the extraordinary opportunity that our modern times offer. Through the affirmation of these rights for more effective recognizing human dignity and universally promoting it as a characteristic inscribed by God, the Creator, in His creature. The Church Magisterium has not failed to note the positive value of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations on December 10, 1948, which Pope John Paul II defined as a true milestone on the path of humanity's moral progress. In fact, the roots of human rights are to be found in the dignity that belongs to each human being. This dignity, inherent in human life and equal in every person, is perceived and understood first of all by reason. The natural foundation of rights appears all the more solid when, in the light of the supernatural, it is considered that human dignity, after having been given by God and having been profoundly wounded by sin, was taken on and redeemed by Jesus Christ in His incarnation, death, and resurrection. The ultimate source of human rights is not found in the mere will of human beings, in the reality of the state, in public powers, but in man himself and in God, his Creator. These rights are universal, inviolable, inalienable, universal because they are present in all human beings without exemption of time, place, or subject. Inviolable insofar as they are inherent in the human person and in human dignity, and because it would be vain to proclaim rights if at the same time everything were not done to ensure the duty of respecting them by all people, everywhere and for all people. Inalienable insofar as no one can legitimately deprive another person, whoever they may be, of these rights, since this would be violence to their nature. Human rights are to be defended not only individually, but also as a whole. Protecting them only partially would imply a kind of failure to recognize them. They correspond to the demands of human dignity and entail, in the first place, the fulfillment of the essential needs of the person in the material and spiritual spheres. These rights apply to every stage of life and to every political, social, economic, and cultural situation. Together, they form a single whole, directed unambiguously towards the promotion of every aspect of the good of both the person and society. The integral promotion of every category of human right is the true guarantee of full respect for each individual right. Universality and indivisibility are distinctive characteristics of human rights. They are two guiding principles which at the same time demand that human rights be rooted in its culture and that their juridical profile be strengthened so as to ensure that they are fully observed. The teaching of Pope John XXIII, the Second Vatican Council, and Pope Paul VI have given abundant indication of the concept of human rights as articulated by the Magisterium. John Paul II has drawn up a list of them in the encyclical Centesimus Annus, the right to life, an integral part of which is the right of the child to develop in the mother's womb from the moment of conception, the right to live in a united family and in a moral environment conducive to the growth of the child's personality, the right to develop one's intelligence and freedom in seeking and knowing the truth, the right to share in the work which makes a wise use of the earth's material resources and to derive from that work the means to support oneself and one's dependents, and the right freely to establish a family, to have and to rear children through the responsible exercise of one's sexuality. In a certain sense, the source and synthesis of this right is religious freedom, understood as the right to live in the truth of one's faith and in conformity with one's transcendent dignity as a person. The first right presented in this list is the right to life, from conception to its natural end, which is the condition for the exercise of all other rights, and in particular implies the illicitness of every form of procured abortion and of euthanasia. Emphasis is given to the paramount value of the right to religious freedom. All men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits. The respect of this right is an indicative sign of man's authentic progress in any regime, in any society, system, or milieu. Inextricably connected to the topic of rights in the issue of the duties falling to men and women, this is given appropriate emphasis in the intervention of the magisterium, the mutual complementaries between rights and duties. They are indissolubly linked, are recalled several times, above all in the human person who possesses them. This bond also has a social dimension. In human society, to one's man's right, there corresponds a duty in all other persons, the duty, namely, of acknowledging and respecting the right in question. The magisterium underlines the contradiction inherent in affirming rights without acknowledging corresponding responsibilities. Those, therefore, who claim their own rights, yet altogether forget or neglect to carry out the respective duties, are people who build with one hand and destroy with the other. The field of human rights has expanded to include the rights of peoples and nations. In fact, what is true for the individual is also true for peoples. The magisterium points out the international law rests upon the principle of equal respect for states, for each people's right to self-determination, and for their free cooperation in view of the higher common good of humanity. Peace is founded not only on respect for human rights, but also on respect for the rights of peoples, in particular the right to independence. The rights of nations are nothing but human rights fostered at the specific level of community life. A nation has a fundamental right to existence, to its own language and culture, to which a people expresses and promotes its fundamental spiritual sovereignty, to shape its life according to its own traditions, excluding, of course, every abuse of basic human rights and in particular the oppression of minorities, to build its future by providing an appropriate education for the younger generation. The international order requires a balance between particularity and universality, which all nations are called to bring about, for their primary duty is to live in a posture of peace, respect, and solidarity with other nations. The solemn proclamation of human rights is contradicted by a painful reality of violations, wars, and violence of every kind. In the first place, genocides and mass deportations, the spreading on a virtual worldwide dimensions of every new forms of slavery, such as trafficking of human beings, child soldiers, the exploitation of workers, illegal drug trafficking, prostitution. Even in countries with democratic forms of government, these rights are not always fully respected. Unfortunately, there is a gap between the letter and the spirit of human rights, which can often be attributed to a merely formal recognition of these rights. The Church social doctrine, in consideration of the privilege accorded by the gospel to the poor, repeats over and over that the more fortunate should renounce some of the rights so as to place their goods more generously at the service of others, and that an excessive affirmation of equality can give rise to an individualism in which each one claims his own rights without wishing to be answerable for the common good. The Church, aware that her essentially religious mission includes the defense and promotion of human rights, holds in high esteem the dynamic approach of today, which is everywhere fostering these rights. The Church profoundly experiences the need to respect justice and human rights within her own ranks. This pastoral commitment develops in a twofold direction: in the proclamation of the Christian foundations of human rights and in the denunciation of the violations of these rights. In any event, proclamation is always more important than denunciation, and the latter cannot ignore the former, which gives it true solidity and the force of higher motivation. For greater effectiveness, this commitment is open to ecumenical cooperation, to dialogue with other religions, to all appropriate contacts with other organizations, governmental and non-governmental, at the national and international levels. The Church trusts above all in the help of the Lord and His Spirit, who, poured forth into human hearts, is the surest guarantee for respecting justice and human rights and for contributing to peace. The promotion of justice and peace and the penetration of all spheres of human society with the light and the leaven of the gospel have always been the object of the Church's efforts in fulfillment of the Lord's command.